Excellent. Seeing all these wonderful people roll in, joining the webinar tonight. See some great people there who have very generously donated their own time as race officials over the years. Special call out to Tracy Johnson, whether you're in Sydney or in Queensland. Noah, I owe you a debt of thanks. I'd like to welcome you all to Australian Sailing's Olympic webinar with our international officials who attended the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. Australian Sailing has enjoyed bringing our Olympians into your homes and connecting them with the sailing community via the Olympic webinar series. Tonight is the final webinar, and I like to believe it's the most exciting webinar of the series, and we will be hearing from the Australians that were on the ground or on the water in Enoshima, Japan, and involved in the race management of the Great Olympic Games. Before we move to those four, I'd just like to give a little mention to two who unfortunately were unable to attend for COVID-related reasons. David Tillett, great judge and umpire out of South Australia, was unable to attend, and David Brooks, one of our great race officers out of Brisbane, he was unable to attend. Neither went to the Games because of COVID reasons, but their willingness to contribute is nonetheless noted. Also like to give a special call out to Richard Slater, who was there in a professional capacity assisting the Australian sailing team. But we had four international officials at the Tokyo Games, and they're all joining us this evening. Now, Barry Johnson and Andre were both there on the technical committee as measurers. Hugh Lester was there as a course representative and as a race officer for the Laser Radial course. And Rosie Collins was there as an international juror at the Games. We will start by hearing from Andre, who is an international measurer. He's based in Blackrock, Victoria, a fin sailor of note. Andre, could you tell us about your experience in Tokyo as we scan through some of the photos that we can see on the screen?
Right. Well, it was a bit different to what we've done before. You know, with COVID and whatnot, it was quite, you know, we were locked up a little bit, but it was a great event. I think the Japanese did a fantastic job in organising under extreme circumstances. So the photos there on the screen are me checking the fins before the start of the event. We make sure all the boats are the same. And comply with the rules. So we did this, what this is called here is the swing test. We then checked all the other bits and pieces on the boat. We templated all the boats and made sure that they were all correct. So, you know, that's what we do. Not as strenuous at other regattas, but at the Olympics we do that. So we had for the fin class, we had an hour per boat to do measuring. Which was great. Gave us a lot of time to do that. So there's they built a wooden box inside my big tent, but the tents were air conditioned. So the temperature in the tent was probably 22 degrees. Or outside it was 36. So it was quite a great environment for doing measuring. So that was good. I don't know, how did it work? I guess we had to stay at our hotels at night, and we would eat in our rooms, either Uber Eats or sometimes we could have a meal at the venue. And you catch a bus for half an hour to the venue, and you'd be at the venue for 12 hours. I don't know. So there we are doing some more checking. It's the boat ramp. And a couple of the guys from World Sailing there watching what I'm doing. Okay, there's on the top left, there's my Japanese team that assisted me doing the checking. The building on the right there is the race or clubhouse. So up the top there where the flagpoles are is the PRO was up there with the main organisers who weren't on the water, and they could see over all the race courses from there. It's pretty good. Then there we've got the uniform we were given. And then on the right's my view from my hotel, the Pan Pacific in Melbourne, when I came home and had to do 14 days quarantine, which was pretty difficult. But yeah, no, it was good. It was a great event. I'm very impressed with the organisation and all the things that are normally done at these regattas. But it was pretty tough, considering we didn't have anyone except the sailors and then the World Sailing Group that we were representing, organising everything. That's all I've really got to say, I think, unless anyone's got some questions.
No, we'll come to questions shortly, Andre. Thank you for that. Now, that's not your first Olympics, is it? That's your second Olympics. You were there in 2016 in Rio, and you've been involved in the Olympics before as a official for the Finn class, representing them. But now we'll move on to Rosie Collins. Rosie, you were involved on the international jury. We know that's a huge job because a lot of this will determine sailors' careers and their outcomes at the event. Tell us about your experience as we walk through some of these photos on the screen.
So I was one of 29 members of the jury, and the final members of the jury, things were still changing even in the month leading up to the event as people had to withdraw for COVID reasons and new jury members substituted in. So roles and responsibilities were shifting even up to about a month before the event. Compared to different events I've done before, we spent an enormous amount of time on prep before the regatta to minimise contact for COVID reasons at the event. And also noting that someone like me, I hadn't actually done an on-water regatta since February 2020. The week before COVID pretty much hit Australia, it was the last Worlds that were done in Australia before COVID came. So there were differing levels of people that had done certain numbers of events basically in the year or a bit over a year before the regatta. So we did a lot of training sessions pretty much every Saturday night or every second Saturday night for months leading up. And that way we could cover all of the things that you normally cover at a briefing session with the jury on those initial days before racing starts. That way we could spend less time in the rooms together, minimise the chance of COVID spread. So on shore, there are a whole heap of procedures in place for COVID reasons, aside from mask wearing, hand sanitizer, things like that. So the jury was split into two different rooms so that if there was a case then that we could potentially not knock out half the jury. We had contingency plan after contingency plan. Our hearings, when we did get started, were in rooms with certain capacity limits. Again, for COVID reasons, they weren't determined by us, they were determined by the COVID officer. We had the plastic screens up, we had different boats and boats were all sanitised between events. So that was quite different to what even a previous Olympics would be like. But once you got on the water, the rules don't change. If you're in the hearing room, the rules don't change at the Olympics compared to any other event you've done. But for my experience as my first event, and the great thing being on the water, you could take off your mask as well if you were comfortable with the other person in your boat. But to me, once you're also on the water, you could see that it is a live event on steroids. So there are multiple helicopters zooming low. There are drones over every mark rounding. There are, instead of saying a couple of media boats on the course, there are 20 media boats on the course. So in that respect, everything's being filmed. You know you need to make the right decision, but the good news is if you make the wrong decision, you're going to know about it because things are filmed from a lot of different angles. I'd just like to echo what Andre also said, that every eventuality to me seemed to be planned for, between the tsunamis and the tsunami warnings, the concerns about typhoons, the concerns about COVID, the issues that people were worried about with heat stroke was all planned out. We knew what to do if anything like this arose, and it ran like clockwork. I don't think Plan B came into effect really. It was all still on Plan A from go to woe for all of those major issues that could have cropped up. So couldn't commend the Japanese people more on running a great event.
Thank you, Rosie. As we move through, you're going to move through this now to Hugh Lester now. Hugh, you had the important job as being race officer for the Laser Radials. Tell us about your time at the Games. Now, Hugh, catchphrase of 2020/2021, you get extra points if you turn yourself off mute before I tell you.
Yeah, I realised that, just as you said, Hugh. So, yeah, just a minor correction that I was course rep for Laser Radial and Laser, so I covered both fleets. I think probably the most interesting aspect of being a course rep is there's a perception that you're the race officer for those fleets, but technically you're not. But in reality, you are responsible for all the decisions that are made on the course. So to me, the job actually entails people management as much as anyone else. The locals aren't going to constantly respond well to constantly being given directions, you must do this, you must do this. I think the way that you need to approach our job is to actually ask questions and lead the local race management teams to the decision that you want them to make. And I believe that's probably the hardest skill to have as a course representative. Obviously, if things are about to go really pear-shaped, you have to jump in and say this needs to be done. But by the way that you've behaved prior to that, when you actually do say, stop, do this now, they actually do respond fairly well. One of the advantages that we had over probably the jury and the measurers is that we had the same team. It was 2 years prior for the test event and the Sailing World Cup event in Enoshima. So it wasn't like that we were coming into this regatta. We've, as Rosie said, we've got cameras on everything, totally blind. We'd actually built up a relationship with the Japanese that we were working with over a period of time. And I certainly had contact with my Japanese team in the 2 years in between the test event and the actual regatta itself. So part of the other job as a course representative is other than running the racing, which is the obvious job that we're doing, there's a lot of other outside influences involved in what's happening on the racetrack, and you have to keep tracking informed. If someone's tracker's failed, you've got a direct link back to the tracking section, and you have to endeavour to change trackers. You've obviously got TV cameras on the boat when you're on one of the televised course areas, and you're constantly feeding information through that TV crew to the director, so the directors are aware of any course change that may be happening. If we're under postponement, as Rosie referred to, there's helicopters there. If we abandoned or postponed racing for whatever reason, obviously having 2 helicopters up in the air costs a lot of money. So they'd go and land, and then the TV director says, well, you can't start racing for 20 minutes. That's how long it's going to take us to get the helicopters back in the air to continue coverage. So so the perception that this is a sailing regatta is quite a bit of a misnomer. It's really a television event that us as race officers and course reps were actually trying to fit in with the telecasts. So you have to liaise with them. There's obviously the job of liaising everything back to the PRO, which was through constant WhatsApp messages of if you're intending to change something. So it's all about making sure everyone's informed of the decisions you're making. You're not actually asking for permission to do anything. You're entrusted with all of that, which is why you get appointed to that job. But everyone on shore needs to understand why and when every decision you actually make is being made and sees it from there. I was also at the London Olympics as an NRO, part of the RYA teams, and really both host nations were completely professional in the way that everything was operated, and the Japanese were superb and could do nothing but help the whole way through the whole process. So I guess that's a summary of where I'm at, Glenn, in about 5 minutes. And if you'd like to carry on, we'll answer questions as they pop up down the track.
I'll tell you what, we've got a couple of questions here that relate exactly to what you've been talking about. So we might top these now. We've got Peter Osborne, who is from Victoria, particularly the Sorrento Sailing Cooter Boat Club, mighty establishment. Peter Osborne asked you, Hugh, were all the course race officers local officials?
Yes.
Excellent. And we've also got another question from Peter Merritt.
Hello, Peter.
Merritt. Yeah, we know Peter. He's a how do you say? He's a known offender, but we know Peter. He's a great man. Peter has asked, Hugh, do you feel that the duplicated course race officer / technical rep is a good use of resources?
I guess in short the answer's no, but the answer's also yes, because in this modern day of fairness, to have the host nation being totally autonomous in all the decisions leaves things open for innuendo that's probably not deserved amongst them. So to have the course reps and the 2 ITOs. So other than me on our course area, we had 2 other ITOs. I had a French lady, Natalie, who was on the start pin, and an Englishman called Tim Hancock, who was overseeing the finishing boat. So the 3 of us, and World Sailing's charter from the IOC is to ensure equal and fair racing for everyone. So in answer to that question, the second part being yes, I believe that's the reason why we are where we are with the situation of World Sailing bringing in 3 officials to oversee the host nation.
Excellent. Thank you, Hugh. I've got another question from Peter, but I'm going to ask Andre if you could listen to this question and give your response as well from the Finn paradigm, because I know you're heavily involved in the Finn class, not just in being a measurer at the Olympics. Now, Peter goes on to ask, do you feel the gold medal race is still a good idea, Hugh? And now I know you're heavily involved in the laser class, not just being a race officer. So this is a policy question, not necessarily a technical question. So from a policy point of view, do you think it's still a good idea? Because this has not been picked up in class world championships. So before you answer, Hugh, Andre, if you could have a little think about this question from the Finn point of view as well. Over to you, Hugh.
Thanks, Glenn. I think I referred to the answer halfway through the the information I spoke about, if you think it's a sailing regatta, you're wrong. It's a TV extravaganza. And as such, people aren't going to tune into 10, 50-minute races. They're quite happy to tune into, Matt Wern for 20 minutes to win the gold medal. And so it's all about TV. And that's precisely the reason that the international laser class does not have medal races. To us, that diminishes the efforts of the lead up races to get to the point. So the laser class believes that the world champion should be the one who's ahead at the end of normal racing, not turning it into some 20-minute TV showpiece. For example, all the round robin racing at the Olympics was started under U flag. All of a sudden we get into the medal race and we change the starting procedure and it's a P flag. So, where's the common sense in that? So, I just refer back to it's for TV.
So Andre, now Rosie, I know you've got a comment. We'll go to you next. But Andre, the Finn class at the Finn Gold Cup, what's their policy on the medal race? I've got two of you now. You'll have to unmute yourself, young man.
Yeah, look, the Finns have been doing the medal race since 2010 or 2011, I believe. We find it's good for media. So, we have Robert Dees, who does a lot of photography and whatnot, and does a pretty good job with Facebook and whatnot. And the class has utilised that medal race for that to make it more exciting, I guess. We've used drones and whatnot to film the races and do that live. But we are now in discussions about removing it because it's quite a lengthy exercise to organise. It's not, and as Hugh said, you at the end of the fleet racing, you don't have the world champion. I don't think we haven't had a Worlds where it's been a big difference in results. But yeah, look, it's something that World Sailing wanted us to do, so we did.
Right, super. Andre, if you could put yourself back on mute for a moment, and Rosie, I'll turn to you now.
My comment is that it's been picked up by some classes and certainly Olympic classes, but not all. So the 49ers who were sort of experimenting with 3 medal races in the very early days have continued with the medal race format, and the NAPRA 17s also do the medal race in their class worlds as well. So it's a class decision and different classes have taken different views.
Thank you, Rosie. We've got one more question from Peter Osborne, as I said, from the Sorrento Sailing and Cooter Boat Club. Now, but Barry, I'm going to ask you this question, even though you haven't had your moment with the microphone yet. I want you to answer this question because you've been, how do we say, with the Olympics for a little while and you've seen the different forms of media. How do you think the competitors feel about being yanked about by the media today, which I'm presuming would not have been the case when you first started?
Hello to everybody, first of all. Look, Glenn, and to Peter, the 49ers always had the media, and I go back to Sydney 2000, and there's probably a photo that's been used ever since then on a lot of yachting calendars, etc., etc. And that was after the last race, where I transferred 3 Jenicas back onto the medalists. And for those that are old enough to remember, we had in 2000 a lot of issues with our Olympic Jenicas, and we had to put racing off for 2 days at the start of the 2000 Olympics for the 49er while new Jenicas were built. and they weren't flagged. But I still had all the spare Jenicas, flag Jenicas. Now that particular time was where we got the boats in front of the Harbour Bridge. Luna Park was on the other side, and the Sydney Opera House was on the other side, and cameras were everywhere. They crawled out of the woodwork. They had helicopters that come off other courses, etc., because they'd got wind of what we were doing. That to me, and I'll always remember a past president of World Sailing, or ISAF or IYAU was in those days, saying to us it was a smart move, and he was happy to take all the credit for it. And that didn't worry me, and I think everyone knows who I'm talking about. But look, media is like any sport now. The sailors are all athletes, and they've come to have to accept that the media is there. Without it, we're not going to survive. Sometimes I get wild because it takes precedent, but unfortunately that's the way it is today in my view, and we've got to accept it and go forward with what is on offer. And you know, media now in 2021 is far different to what it was in 2020.
Thank you, Barry. It does. Thank you, Barry. And we don't often hear you getting wild, do we? So whilst we're with you, there's a lot of people, you know, we've got a lot of people on the chat with us tonight listening in. Now, you've been with the 49ers the whole time they've been in the Olympics, but just for the listeners, could you let us all know how many Paralympic sailing events and how many Olympic sailing events you have served in an official capacity at?
Well, the 49er first came in Sydney, which was 2020. We had two test events, one in 1999, one in 1998. And I basically started from 1998 with the 49er, and I've now done 6 Olympics.
That's a magnificent effort, Barry. You must be doing something right for all the decision makers to keep inviting you back, and we applaud that. But it's not just the Olympics. You've also been involved in the Paralympics, I believe.
No, Glenn, more the Asian Games, which is huge. It probably has, in some instances, in the early parts of Asian Games, had more athletes than what the Olympic Games had.
Wonderful.
But I sort of was helped Noel Robbins a little bit going into 2020. 2000, because Noel was who won the gold medal in the sonar class. I'd sailed with on Hitchhiker for years, but a lot of people don't know, but Noel was also my trades teacher at high school. So I'd known him for a long, long time before he became a paraplegic, to be honest with you. Okay. And so I had a soft spot when for the Paralympics and parasailing, and I was just a little bit sad when they got dropped from the actual Olympic Games or the Paralympic Games.
Yeah. So Barry, that's 6 Olympics, all involved in the 49er. Could you tell us then what has or hasn't changed across those 6 events? Tell us about your experience at this event, but also how it compares to the others, the 5 that preceded it.
Well, it hasn't changed greatly, and if you look up in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a 49er turned upside down with a template on it to measure the rocker. We had a template for Sydney in 2000, but not made of aluminium. It was a fiberglass one, which took 3 people to lift up and put over the boat. It was a big heavy thing, but it did exactly the same job as what that particular thing was there. Then in the middle, in the top and down and below the template on the hull, I'm doing some mast checks, etc. And those checks were carried out. We've never changed our modelling or our inspection process from what we started off in 1998, in actual fact, all the way through to now. Remembering that with the Olympic Games, we get a half an hour per boat because we've only got 20 boats. And if you go back to before Rio, we didn't have the FX, and we had 6 days of measurement for 20 boats. Now we got 40 boats and we get 3 days because we've got the FX, which is no different to what the 49er is. So nothing has changed. And where Andre showed you some photos with his volunteers, etc., Rob Taylor from the RYA was a new 49er measurer, an international measurer. He came to the event and we only had one local volunteer. And we tried to find work for that volunteer. Lovely guy. English wasn't the best for him, but he understood what we were doing and he was very, very helpful. But we probably didn't need the extra pieces, the extra people. The question was asked of Hugh earlier about, is it a waste of resources? Well, sometimes I think in some areas, we may have too many, I'll use the words volunteers or race officials in a broad term there. And sometimes they've found that they get bored because they don't have something to do. I know in Hugh's situation that's not the case, and also in Rosemary's situation, but in measurement it can be. Because a 49er is a manufacturer's class, so there are no specifications that we have there for the 49er like Andre has for the fin. That's a builder's class. It's a measurement control class. We're not. We're a builder's control class. So our class rules are far, far different and far less than what the 470, the fin, etc. has. And sometimes it worries me that, and it's come up now, we've lost the fin for 2024, where we're not going to have these specialists. Andre does so many things with the fin that are mind-boggling. But we don't do that because we don't have to, and we're not called upon to do it in the 49er. So that it is. People think that all the measuring is the same, but it's not. It's not. The 470 is, as I said, is like Andre's with the fins. The Yingling used to be the same, the Soling and so forth. But now with these builders classes coming in, we're going away from true physical measurement to equipment inspection. And that can lead the door open for some, fiddling. I'll use the word fiddling with equipment. And there are instances where you could go to an event and you may not see it, but then all of a sudden something happens and you hear about it in the boat park. And of course, like all race officials, we don't take any notice of boat park talk. It's because, and I'll go back and I'll tell guys that go and win on the water. Don't go and win in the room or whatever. Go and win it on the water. Win the race on the water. So, things have changed a lot. And that worries me in that we're going away from the measurement control classes. I don't know whether Andre agrees with me or not, but it'd be good to hear what he has to say about that.
Andre, please.
Look, it's disappointing the fin won't be there. It's, to me, it's we've gone towards this measurement, this builders controlled classes. There are some issues, I think. The NACRAs have had some problems, but they're working through that. And I know Barry has worked a little bit with some templates to try and make sure that nothing happens in the 49er class over time. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm a little bit worried for the 470 class. I think going to a total new concept with male, female as the sailors might destroy their class. I hope it doesn't. I I know with the Finn, we've got a Masters running this week, and we've got 100 people sailing over in Spain during this COVID time, which I think is pretty impressive. So, yeah, I don't know. We'll see. We've still got our fingers crossed to maybe get back to when we go to the US after Paris. We'll see. Who knows?
So we have a question from Andrew Simpson. Andrew Simpson is with the Double Bay Sailing Club, one of Australia's great laser clubs, but of course also right beside the Australian 18 Footers League at the other end of the scale, those boats. And Andrew asks, and I'll throw, because we're with you, Barry, we'll throw, and I know that you're on World Sailing committees, throw this over to you. What do you think about the changes to the classes being used in the Olympic Games? Because you've been there since the 49er was introduced. So you've seen a new class come in, and now 6 Olympic Games later, you're seeing it happen again with classes changed. What do you think about the changes to the classes? And also, do you think the media has played a part in those decisions?
Great question. Real good question. Yes, I have seen a lot of changes, and I don't want to go through them all, but there'd probably be 5 or 6 changes or class changes that I've seen. And what worries me more about continual changing, and it's basically it happens every 2 years or 2 quads or whatever, but sometimes it happens after 1 quad, is the cost that's involved. And this is not helping our sport one little bit, in my view. And none of us here, even on some of the committees that I've sat on or sitting on now, you can fight nail and tooth, and you can till you're blue in the face to try and not have changes made. And I can remember when we're at a meeting, and it wasn't that long ago, and they were talking about flicking the laser, if I can use that word, for another class, and I ramped up very much so. And I was only one of 2 from that particular committee that voted for the laser. All the rest wanted this new class. But then when you went and talked to some of those people after the meeting, why did you vote for them? Well, what sort of boat is it? And you ask the question, I beg your pardon? Well, what sort of boat was it? Were they going to replace it with? I said, well, you voted for it. You should know what it is. But yeah, look, I could go on, and I don't want to waste everyone's time, but there's too much changing around of classes. Let's stabilise. If we don't stabilise, one day the IOC is going to turn around and say, well, unless sailing gets itself stabilised, we could do without it. And I'll just mention something. I got an article today, and they're talking about the 2026 Commonwealth Games, which is only just over 4 years away. And they're hoping that Perth are going to put their hand up because they haven't got anywhere to have it yet, but they're going to leave it to the organisers from the host state or country to pick the sports that they would like. Well, I know the mayor here, and I might have to have a talk to him if they do go into it and say, well, bring in a couple of classes. You're not going to bring in all your Olympic classes, but that's maybe a way of getting sailing into the Commonwealth Games. But see, Commonwealth Games now are opening it up to letting the actual host nation start to pick the classes. That may happen in IOC, probably not in my time, but it may happen one day. And then God help us, because if that was to happen, you'd have a different class. You'd want to be a Twiggy Forrest, to be honest with you, to go sailing, because your pocket wouldn't afford it. And Glenn, Australian sailing wouldn't be able to afford to keep running an Australian team, in all honesty. I hope that's answered the question from our learned friend from Double Bay.
I believe you have. Look, I'd just like to add to something. Yeah, for the people listening. Yeah, world sailing is the decision making framework and environment there is, and I say this in inverted commas, it's as interesting as it is complex. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that there. It's as interesting as it is complex. None of this stuff, you know, it's just complex. And once the conversation starts and it goes into official channels, the governance process has to consider it, and it's complex. It is really, really difficult environment. Hey, but just moving on, we've heard from Nadine to back, and I'm going to open this perhaps to Hugh first, but each of the other three, if you could comment from your discipline of race officiating. Now, Nadine's from the Royal Melbourne Yacht Squadron. They run some great events down there, particularly the Australian Women's Keelboat Championship. Nadine has been a club level race officer there for, and I quote, one very interrupted season. Hugh, could you please explain what sort of differences one might expect between race officering in one of these formats, and what steps somebody like Nadine should take to fulfil a goal to be a course official, a race officer in 2032?
I turned the mic on this time, so I'm learning. Interesting question. I'll probably oversimplify my answer and say ultimately, whether you're officiating at club level or at Olympic level, what you're trying to achieve is the same. We're trying to achieve fair and equal racing for all competitors on the racetrack. So from what you're trying to achieve, that's my answer. How to get there is an interesting question. I'm fairly lucky in how I got to where I am is I'm, as Glenn alluded to, and those that don't know, I'm actually vice president of the International Laser Association. And in 2000, I was elected to World Council and flown to Ireland for my first World Council meeting, where I sat in a room for one day and it cost the class about $4,500. And I said to the then executive secretary of the class, Jeff Martin, that I thought that was terrible value for the class. And at the next World Championships, where the World Council was always held, I offered a week of my time to help Jeff in whatever way he decreed. I'd never done any race officialing before that. So aligning with a class can go a long way to help you move up the ladder. It gets you the level of regattas that you need to move up the totem pole, so to speak. So going through, there's two pathways, and one is as a class sponsored race official, and the other is through your MNAs, education and programs like that. But I'm reasonably certain that to move up, you need to try and align yourself with someone running regular regattas and constantly be there and gain experience. The more experience you gain, the easier making decisions becomes for you. So I guess that's my answer, Glenn.
Thank you. Now, Andre, you're aligned with the class, the Fin class. Now, you're not a race officer, you're a very talented measurer. Is there anything you'd like to add to what Hugh explained about the difference between what we might call normal officiating and being at the Olympics, but also the pathway to get to the Olympics?
Yeah, I think what Hugh was sort of saying is class is quite easy, or easier. You can then align yourself with a group, and it's by doing the same thing more often, you learn a bit easier. If you're trying to do things at different different regattas, different classes, I would say that would be quite difficult. So, for example, if I wanted to become a measurer and went to the 49ers and then to the NACRAs and then to the 470s, they're all so different. You'd be learning new stuff all the time. But that said, there's all these courses available for either measuring or being on a jury or being a race officer, and that's a good start. And then you meet people, and maybe you there's a regatta on next month or in another state, and you say, well, can I come along, and that sort of thing. So it's a bit, I don't know, that's how it works. You know, I can remember a friend of mine, Ross Wilson, doing an OK Worlds at Black Rock in '90, I think, with Greg Hennessy, and from that, you know, he then went and represented the country at the Olympics as well as a race officer. So it's just I don't know, it's a job, but you do have to work at it. It doesn't come easily. You have to go and a fair bit of time. You know, I would suggest I'd probably do 3 or 4 weeks a year away from the family to continue doing what I do, and I'm sure the race officers and the jury do the same.
Actually, Rosie, just turning to you then, I know that you've got a young family. You're supported by a wonderful, wonderful husband. Just like to have that on the record. Rosie, your pathway to becoming an international judge, first of all, would you like to suggest to Nadine that she might like to reconsider a career as a judge? That's something you'd recommend to Nadine, but also perhaps you could comment on what your pathway was to become an international judge.
It was at the Olympics, and there were only, what, 12 race officers and perhaps 18 race officers and fewer than that measurers. So if you're looking for a pure numbers game, judging might be the way to go. I came to judging inadvertently. I had been sailing the Laser, sailing it a lot at Double Bay in Sydney. I relocated to Brisbane, and shortly thereafter I got very ill and I wasn't able to sail and I wasn't able to do much at all. And whilst I was recovering from my illness, the national championships for the Laser class rolled into town, and they were at my new club, the Royal Queensland Yacht Squadron. And I see that Greg Kemp and Mark Gallagher are also on the call from RQ tonight. So thanks for joining. And one of our local Laser class members suggested to me that given I wasn't very strong, I was still very weak from surgery I'd had, that perhaps I would like to join the jury and be the jury secretary and see what the jury does. And if I was feeling up to it, I could go on the water with them and learn. And I made it down every day of the regatta, and I got to sit in on the hearings, and I did go out on the water some days, and I quite enjoyed it. And by coincidence, my club was hosting 3 World Championships that year. And I was invited then to continue to be the jury secretary at those 3 World Championships. And the jury chair at each of those championships was very welcoming to me and treated me just as a member of the jury, and I could sit in on the hearings and go out on the water every day. So I was pretty fortunate in that in my first 6 months of judging, I did 2 national championships and 3 world championships, and I learned from some of the best judges in the world. Now, that is not a common path, but what I would recommend is that you, like Andre and like Hugh have echoed, you get involved in a particular class. So for me, that was the Laser class for a long time. I don't do so much with them now. I'm doing a bit more with Barry with the 49ers and the NACRAs. But knowing a class in particular is very good. You get to understand the class expectations, and spending time with more experienced officials you can learn from some really fantastic officials. And if you're in the Melbourne area, there are some amazing judges that live there that are, I'm sure would be happy to show you the ropes, get you involved. You do some more regattas, you get invited to more places, and it does take a lot of time, and as my health improved, I went back to competing some more and shifted to sailing them off. And so when I'm doing more competing, I'm doing less officiating, so it's always a bit of a balance for me. And right now I have small children, so I'm not doing a whole heap of anything. But with time and with spending the time to learn from the great race officers and judges and measurers that we have in Australia, you can go to the Olympics, or you could travel the world going to different world championships. There's great opportunities, and more importantly, you can give back to the sport that we've all benefited so much from. I've certainly done the Australian sailing courses as well. I've presented them, I've participated in them, they're great. The discussions that you have with the other participants and also with the course leaders for each of the courses are really valuable. And you also make good connections where the people can then invite you to other events if you're interested. So I definitely wouldn't discount doing the courses as well, because I think that's quite important, not just for the content, but for the people that you'll meet.
Thank you, Rosemary. Now, look, I'm going to ask my question to close this out. We've got 7 minutes left, and it's a tough question. Barry Johnson invited tough questions without mitigation or holding back. I want to talk about trapeze harness related decisions because the racing rules have changed. Hugh, you don't even know what a trapeze harness is, so don't you laugh. The racing rules of sailing have changed. There are a couple of new rules regarding trapeze harness weights, but also quick release. There were decisions made at the Olympics that affected competitor scores. Barry, I'll take the question for you first to work out how, and then I'll steer the question to close out with Rosie around the decision. Barry, could you tell us how the weight of the trapeze harness is picked up and why it's important?
Well, Glenn, thank you for that one. I appreciate it. Yes, we had a problem, and it was one particular brand of trapeze harness, an excellent brand, an excellent trapeze harness. But the sailors didn't do their homework beforehand. Anyway, on a particular day, I think it was after race or day 3 of the 49er racing, I can't remember. I think it was day 3 or day 2, I can't remember. But anyway, we pulled all the 49er and 49er FX sailors off the water when they came ashore, and they went up to the big office that Andre showed you, where we had a drum of water. And us remembering these guys are still in their trapeze harnesses and their sailing attire, the coaches and the boatmen, etc., with their equipment, their hulls and that. They took the trapeze harness off. They were dipped into, or not dipped, but they were submerged in a drum of fresh water. They were then hung up for a minute to drain. Then they were put on a scale to be weighed. One came in at 2.3 kilos. Another one came in at 2.1 kilos. That was the boys. I had no choice but to protest because the class had not amended its class rules from what is in the racing rules of sailing, which was that the trapeze harness shall weigh no more than 2 kilos. It cost the Irish team 3 races. It cost the Brazilian team 3 races. But more importantly for the Irish team, it cost them a medal race position and the possibility of medaling because they were sailing extremely well and had a very good day that day. I can't remember, but I think Rosie might have been on the protest panel for that one. The following day, we had another protest because we had the Chinese girls also got picked out from that group, and they were 2.35 kilos. And they lost all their racing, but they didn't understand what was going on. But the rule is it had to comply with the racing rules of sailing, except where amended by the class rule. And the 49er had not amended its class rule or put in a class rule to increase the weight of the trapeze harness, which I recommended to the class they do in 2019, because we had the same incident occur at the test event in 2019. And the class rejected it. Well, those that rejected it, in one instance, were those that got caught. So they only had themselves to blame. But everything was done according to the book, as I'll say, the blue book. Racing Rule 50.4, is that correct, Rosie?
Oh, now you're testing me.
I think it was. Anyway.
50.1 says the 12-year-old from the office.
Oh.
And hiking or trapeze harness shall have positive buoyancy and shall not weigh more than 2 kilograms, except that class rules may specify a higher weight. So Barry, this is really interesting. We have this perception through sailing that we're a self-police sport. Whereas his role must have been very uncomfortable for you at the event, having to play this role and go through the procedure. How do you feel when you know the impact of what you're compelled to do?
Well, you don't feel good. You don't feel good at all, as also the jury members don't feel good. But you've got the racing rules of sailing, which is the Bible, so you've got to abide by them. Now, if I hadn't have protested it, and then a team that saw that the weight was, because all the weights were recorded on a whiteboard, so for everyone to view. So if a team had have protested it, and the jury had known that I had been or knew what the thing was but didn't protest, well, then I'm the one that's in trouble as well. So, but you feel very uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, the racing rules are very, very clear. It's the responsibility of the sailor or the athlete to ensure that they are compliant. So the responsibility lies back with them.
Thank you, Barry. Now, Rosie, turning to you and the role that the jury plays at the Olympics, how complex is an equipment-related hearing compared to, say, a boat-on-boat hearing?
It depends on the equipment hearing in particular. And these ones, the trapeze harness ones, the facts of the weights of the harness was pretty clear, and I wasn't on the first of the 2 hearings, but I did sit on the third. And I've got to admit that I was surprised to 3 days down the track after the first trapeze harness hearing, still having more in that respect, because day one, or the first day that there were hearings, as Barry said, I think that was the 470 women or the 49 men, one of the two. 2 boats disqualified. Then the next day, 2 more boats disqualified from a different fleet. And then a third day, more boats disqualified. Surely the competitors have seen these disqualifications and gone and checked their equipment. So it's the Olympic Games. You're responsible for your equipment. So yes, these hearings sometimes can be more complicated, but with excellent measures and technical committee members, they can become a lot more straightforward. And these ones were not so complicated because it's something, we're not talking about different ways to measure the rocker or something like that on a fin. We're looking at the weight of an object, or the submerged and drained weight of the trapeze harness. And like any hearing, the jury will hear what's in front of them. They will get the evidence presented, and they will interpret the rules against the facts the same way they do every hearing.
So, Rosie, I guess the last question for the night before we close this webinar off, thank everyone for attending. These were commercially available products, very successful products in the market. I actually suspect I've owned one as well. The This isn't modified equipment for a performance advantage. It's more of a non-compliance issue using a commercially available product. How do you feel in a protest committee knowing that it's a compliance issue, not necessarily a deliberate performance exercise on the part of the competitors?
The same rules that are applying to everyone. And it's our role to apply penalties where there is a breach of those rules. It's the classes, it's other organisations' roles to amend those rules if they see fit. And these, as Barry said, these rules weren't amended. A disqualification does at first glance seem harsh, but if the classes involved wanted a different penalty, they were free to change the rules at any time before the Olympic Games.
So what I'm hearing from you both as we close out this webinar is that it's a tough job, it's awkward, it's not comfortable, but the rules and the procedures are very, very clear, and it's just something that you're compelled to do. Andre, Hugh, Barry and Rosemary, I'd like to thank you both. Thank you all, both. I'd like to thank you all for being here this evening. I'd like to thank you all for having served as race officials in Australia for such a long time. For those of you who are on the call, and I've noticed there's quite a few of you, particularly Ross, Peter, who have also served as race officials for a long, long time, I hope you all got something out of this. The recording will be available on the internet soon. It will be circulated to race officials and through Australian Sailing social media. To the team behind the scenes, those faceless people who have made this evening work, Gemma and Olivia, thank you both very much. Everyone, go home, enjoy your afternoon or evening.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you. See you, Baz.
See you, Andre. See
See you,
you,
Glenn.
Glenn.
Hey, Barry,
Yeah.
you said we could ask tough questions.